She had $7.50. That was all that stood between her and nothing: a train platform in Wyoming, a dead man's broken promise, and a stranger watching her from across the station. He didn't know her name. She didn't know his. But something in the way he said 4 words stopped her cold. You can say no. In 1886, nobody said that to a woman alone with nowhere to go. What happened next didn't look like a love story. It looked like a transaction. The whole town decided it was a transaction. And Clara Reed spent the next 6 months living inside a story that other people had written about her, while quietly, in a locked east bedroom by lamplight, she was writing a very different story of her own, one that New York would eventually read under her real name. This is a story about what dignity looks like when everything else has been taken, about a man who built 4 empty bedrooms for a family he was too afraid to want, and about the strange grace of arriving at exactly the wrong place and choosing to stay anyway. This channel is home to stories of the American West, the dust and the distance, the love that grows slow and holds hard, the mothers who never quit, and the strangers who become something more. Stories about what it means to be human when the land gives you no place to hide. What this story gives you is something worth holding on to. The reminder that your circumstances do not define your worth. That the right question is never, is this my place? It's, does this person need someone to ask? And that truly choosing from want instead of fear changes everything. Not just for you, for everyone who stands beside you. If this story moved something in you, don't let it go quietly. Leave a comment and tell me what stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're new here, subscribe, because there are more stories coming, and every single one of them was built for you.
The train had already gone. Clara Reed knew this without looking up. She could feel the absence of it. The platform had stopped vibrating beneath her boots. The steam smell was thinning in the afternoon air, and the particular silence that follows a departure had settled over Coldwater Creek Station like a held breath. She was counting money. Not because she didn't know the amount, she knew exactly. $7.50. She had counted it twice on the train, and once in the station, and now she was counting it again because it was the one thing her hands could do that made sense right now. And her hands needed something to do, or she was going to stand here on this platform in Wyoming territory and fall apart in front of strangers. Her hands were not steady. That was new. Clara Reed's hands had held steady through 10 years of chalk dust and school primers. Through the winter, her husband Robert got sick. In the spring, he didn't recover. Through 3 years of being alone after that. Through the morning, she locked the door of the last room she'd ever rented in Columbus, Ohio, and walked to the train station without looking back. Her hands knew how to work when her mind wasn't present. Today, her mind was in too many places at once. Thomas Flagg had been polite about it. That was the worst part, somehow. He'd introduced himself clearly, explained the situation without stumbling over it. Arthur, his younger brother, the man whose letters she had been reading for 6 months, the man whose careful handwriting she had come to trust. Arthur had died 4 days ago. A wagon accident on a creek crossing. Quick at least, Thomas said, as if that helped. The deposit money, the money Arthur had sent east to secure her passage and first month's wages, was gone. Spent before the accident on repairs the ranch needed. Thomas had no obligation legally to provide anything further. He was sorry for the trouble. He had pressed coins into her palm with the practiced efficiency of a man settling a debt. And then he had walked away. And Clara had stood there on the platform of Coldwater Creek, Wyoming territory, in September of 1886, and understood that she had arrived at the exact wrong moment in someone else's story. And there was no one here who thought of it as the wrong moment in hers, $7.50. Not enough for a ticket back to Columbus, not enough to start anything new. Enough for 1 night's lodging and 1 meal, and a diminishing set of options after that. She finished counting. Put the money back in her coat pocket. Looked around the platform with the methodical attention she had developed over years of walking into unfamiliar schoolrooms and figuring out what was needed. The station was small, one wood frame building with a covered porch, two benches, a chalk schedule board. The next eastbound train departed tomorrow morning, a freight office on the far end, a water pump beside it, three men she didn't recognize loading crates onto a flatbed wagon. A woman in a gray coat waiting on one of the benches, clearly not planning to speak to anyone. A teenage boy sweeping the porch with the focus of someone being paid by the hour. And a man standing near the freight office who'd been standing there for the past 5 minutes without moving toward anything. Clara noticed him the way she noticed everything, practically without particular feeling attached. Tall, work-worn coat, hat pulled against the afternoon glare. He was looking at her, but not the way the station agent had looked at her when she'd asked about lodging. That man had looked at her like she was a complication. This man was looking at her the way someone looks at a situation they are trying to understand before they decide what to do about it. She turned away, picked up her bag, thought about her options in the order they presented themselves. Behind her, she heard boots on the platform boards, even, unhurried, stopping about 3 feet away. "Ma'am?" She turned. He was closer than she'd expected, but not in a way that felt like pressure. His face was the kind of face Wyoming makes, sun-weathered, spare with expression, eyes that had spent years looking at distances. He held his hat in his hands. "I've got a ranch about 7 miles out," he said. "Need someone to help with the house and tend to an injured horse. 6 months. Fair wages. Your own room with a lock on the inside. You can say no." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "How much a month?" she asked. He told her. The number was fair. Not generous, not insulting. Exactly what ranch help was worth in this part of the territory. "I need to know your name," she said. "James Aldrin." "I can leave whenever I choose?" "You can." She looked at him for one more second. A man who said you can say no when he was offering something. A man who led with the lock on the door. She picked up her bag. "All right," she said, "Mr. Aldrin." Neither of them noticed the station agent watching from the freight office doorway. Neither of them saw the woman in the gray coat turn to look. Neither of them understood as they walked toward the wagon at the far end of the platform that 8 people on and around that station had just watched James Aldrin hand money to a strange woman with bruised wrists and load her onto his wagon. The story that formed in Coldwater Creek that evening was not the story that had actually happened. But it was the story that would define both of them for the months ahead, and it was already settled before the wagon cleared the edge of town. They rode mostly in silence, the silence of 2 people who don't know each other yet and understand that filling the space with noise doesn't help. The land opened up around them, wide, pale-grassed, cut by the dark line of the Laramie Range to the west. The sky was the particular deep blue that comes in Wyoming in late afternoon, the kind of sky that makes Ohio feel like a memory from someone else's life. Clara sat straight on the wagon bench with her bag at her feet and watched the land go past and thought about the next practical thing. A room, a lock on the door. 6 months of work she knew how to do. When the ranch came into view, a solid house, a good barn, a split-rail fence running east into the trees, James said, not looking at her. "Rooms on the east side, door locks from the inside." "Thank you," Clara said. From the barn, a horse made a low sound at the familiar noise of the wagon. Clara filed that away. The horse knew this wagon. The horse knew this man. Whatever had happened in Arthur Flagg's letters, whatever life she had imagined arriving to find, this was the life that was actually here, a ranch, a man of few words, an injured horse. She could work with that. The wagon stopped. James climbed down and offered his hand to help her down, a courtesy, nothing more, and he released her hand the moment she was on the ground. She picked up her bag. "Kitchen's through the front," he said. "I'll get your trunk when the supply order comes in from town." "I didn't bring a trunk," she said, "just the one bag." He looked at the bag for a moment. "All right," he said, and left it at that. The name hit her before breakfast. Helen Marsh arrived at Aldrin Ranch at 7 in the morning with a supply delivery, flour, salt, lamp oil, and addressed Clara as she set the flour sack on the kitchen table. "Morning, Mrs. Aldrin. You settling in all right?" Clara set down the coffee pot. "My name is Clara Reed. I'm here on a work contract." Helen Marsh was a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and the direct manner of someone who has run a store for 30 years and learned to say useful things efficiently. She didn't argue. She nodded. But as she turned to go, she said it quietly. More information than warning. "Whole town heard about it last night, honey. You might want to know that before you go in for supplies." Clara stood in the kitchen after Helen left and understood what she was dealing with. She was inside a story other people had written about her before she had a chance to write her own. The story was not malicious. It was just the story that 8 people on a train platform had assembled from what they saw, and stories like that in small towns spread faster than correction can follow. James came in for breakfast at 7:30, and she told him what Helen had said. He listened, drank his coffee, said, "I'll explain it to people when I go in for supplies today." "Mr. Aldrin," she said, and she kept her voice even. "Do you understand why that won't be as simple as it sounds?" He looked at her. "A man explaining what something means has a certain kind of weight," she said. "A woman explaining what something means has a different kind of weight. That's not my opinion. That's just how it works here. If you go into town and say this is a work arrangement, people will nod and say of course, and they will go right on believing what they already believe." James was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who thought before speaking, which Clara was beginning to understand was rarer than it should be. "What do you need me to do?" he said. That was the right question. She noticed it was the right question. "Nothing yet," she said. "I just need you to understand what I'm navigating. That's enough for now." He nodded, finished his coffee, then, "Come look at the horse after breakfast. That's the most pressing thing." The most pressing thing. Clara found she appreciated that. The way he moved to what was concrete and actionable without dismissing what she'd said. He'd heard it. He'd stored it. He was moving forward. She could work with that. Dusk was in the second stall, standing with her left front leg held slightly off the ground, not refusing to bear weight, but clearly preferring not to. The leg had been wrapped, but wrapped the way someone wraps when they know the general idea but not the specific mechanics. James explained the situation. A pulled tendon, a veterinarian from Laramie, who had come out 3 weeks ago and given instructions, a supply order of proper dressings and liniment that had just arrived on that morning's freight. "The wrapping," Clara said when he finished. "Can I look at it? That's why I brought you over here." She knelt beside Dusk's leg and examined what had been done. The horse turned her head and sniffed at Clara's shoulder, not the behavior of an animal meeting a stranger. More the behavior of an animal who was resigned to being handled and was checking to see whether this particular handling was going to be worthwhile. "Who was wrapping her before I came?" Clara asked. "Neighbor's hired man came out twice a week, did his best." Clara ran her fingers carefully along the line of the bandage. "With a pulled tendon, the pressure needs to graduate from top to bottom. More support at the top, easing off toward the hoof. Uniform pressure like this restricts the blood flow. It slows healing." James crouched beside her, looked at where her fingers were. "How do you know that?" "I ran the county medical station out of my schoolroom for 8 years. No doctor within 12 miles. You learn what you need to learn." A pause. Then James said, "Show me how to do it correctly." That was the second right thing he said in one morning. Clara noticed that too. She unwrapped the bandage and started again, explaining as she worked. The anatomy of the tendon, why graduated pressure mattered, how to read the horse's reaction to gauge whether the wrap was right. Dusk stood with the stillness of an animal that has learned patience through necessity, turning once to look at what Clara was doing with what seemed like considered evaluation. James watched everything, asked 2 questions, both of them good ones, made no attempt to take over or redirect. When she finished and stood, he said, "Same time tomorrow?" "I'll need to check the leg morning and evening for the first week," Clara said. "After that, once a day should be sufficient." "All right." He stood, looked at the horse, then at Clara. "Breakfast is at 6, supper's at 7 unless the work runs long. There's no set time for anything else. Do what the job needs." "That suits me," she said. And that, essentially, was how the arrangement began. What Clara did not know yet was that James had ridden into town that afternoon and explained the situation to 3 people. Helen Marsh, Ted Norris the blacksmith, and the postmaster, and that all three had listened politely and gone right on believing what they already believed. What James did not know yet was that the woman unpacking her single bag in the East Room had spent 6 years writing articles about women's rights under a man's pen name, and that one of those articles had just been reprinted by a newspaper in New York. What neither of them knew yet was how much those two facts were going to matter. The ranch revealed itself slowly, the way a landscape reveals itself when you stop trying to see all of it at once and just look at what's directly in front of you. Clara had been at Aldrin Ranch for a week when she began to understand what she was living inside, not the daily details. Those had been clear from the first morning. She knew where the water pump was, how the stove worked, which window stuck when the wind came from the north, how much wood James used overnight, and how much she should stack by the kitchen door before turning in. What she began to understand in the second week was the shape of the place, the kind of shape that tells you about the person who built it. The house had 4 bedrooms. James used 1. The others had beds, plain but functional, made up with the mechanical tidiness of someone who had made them up and then never used them. The kitchen was stocked with enough pots and pans to feed a family of 8. The dining table seated 10. The cellar held preserves and dry goods packed with the kind of systematic density that comes from genuine preparation. Not casual surplus, but deliberate provision. Enough food to carry a large household through a Wyoming winter. James Aldrin had lived here alone for 6 years. Clara did not ask about this. It wasn't her business, and she understood the difference between curiosity and understanding that you've earned. But she worked in the space that had been built for more people than lived in it, and every day something new registered. The water system was the most telling. She found this on the 4th day when a pipe fitting at the kitchen sink came loose, and she traced it back to the main line to fix it. The system branched to 3 points: the house, the barn, and a third line that ran west to a corner of the property where there was nothing but grass and an old fence post. Someone had planned for a third building there. The plan had never been completed. She fixed the fitting, didn't mention the third branch to James. On the 6th day, he came back from town and set 2 things on the kitchen table without comment: a newspaper and a small cloth-bound book. Clara looked at the book. She looked at it for longer than she meant to. It was a collected edition of speeches on women's rights: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, speeches from the suffrage conventions of the previous decade, published in 1881. Not a book you found in every general store. Not a book most men in Wyoming Territory would think to pick up. "Have you read this?" she asked. "No, but somebody in town had it for sale, and I figured you might want something to read." Simple answer. Except it wasn't simple at all, and they both knew it, even if neither said so. He had been in Coldwater Creek for the afternoon. He had gone to some trouble to find that book specifically. He had not brought her a novel or a recipe collection or a Bible. He had brought her that, which meant he had been paying attention to her in a way she hadn't fully accounted for. "Thank you," she said. She meant it. That evening she took inventory of the cellar, organizing it, logging what was there, the way she had always approached any system she was responsible for maintaining. The stores were enough for 2 people through winter with comfortable margin. More than James needed alone. Less than it seemed like he was planning for, given the size of everything else on the ranch. She sat with that for a while, then she went back to work. The following Tuesday, she fixed a section of fence on the south pasture edge, a board that had come loose from its post and was flapping in the afternoon wind in a way that would only get worse. She had nails in her coat pocket from a different repair, and it took 10 minutes. When she and James walked the south fence line 2 days later, checking the winter readiness, a task he'd mentioned needing to do, he stopped at that section and examined the repair without having been told it was there. "You did this," he said. Not a question. It was flapping. He looked at it for another moment. Then he moved on to the next section, and she noticed that for the rest of the fence walk he fell in behind her rather than ahead, not following her instructions, just letting her set the pace, because she had already covered this ground and knew where the problems were. Small thing. She noticed it anyway. The nights were the quietest she had experienced since Ohio. Wyoming dark was deeper than Ohio dark. Fewer lights, more sky, the particular silence of land that has more space in it than presence. She sat at the small desk in her east room after supper most evenings and read the book he'd brought her, the newspaper, a medical reference she'd carried from Columbus, and she thought about the letter in her inside coat pocket. The letter from the editor in Ohio, the one that had been waiting at the Coldwater Creek post office when she'd gone in for mail. The one that said a piece she had published 3 years ago under the pen name C.M. Reed had been picked up and reprinted by a larger publication in New York. The editor wanted to know if C.M. Reed was still writing. She had not written anything since boarding the train west. She took out a piece of paper, set her pen down beside it, looked at the blank page for a long time, went to bed without writing anything. The next morning, James was repairing the barn door hinge when she brought him coffee at mid-morning, a habit that had formed somewhere in the second week without either of them deciding it should. He took the cup, looked at the hinge, said, "You know anything about basic carpentry?" "Enough to be useful," she said. "Not enough to be impressive. Useful is what I need." They spent the morning on the barn door together. He knew the mechanics. She was good at the detail work, holding things precisely level, driving nails at the exact angle required, catching the small misalignments before they became problems. They worked without much conversation, which she had come to understand was not unfriendliness, but was simply how James worked. He talked when there was something to say. He didn't fill silence for the sake of filling it. She had spent years in rooms full of people who filled every silence with sound. She didn't miss that. By the time the door hung straight and both hinges moved without catching, the morning was almost gone. James tested the swing of it 3 times, the way a careful man tests a thing he's fixed before trusting it. "Good work," he said. 2 words. But he said them looking straight at the door they'd just fixed together, and there was nothing in his voice except the plain acknowledgement of a fact. Clara picked up the coffee cups and went in to start the midday meal, and did not examine why 2 words from a quiet man felt like more than they should. She rode into Coldwater Creek alone for the first time on a Thursday in mid-October. James had ranch business on the south property and gave her the supply list and directions to the 3 places she'd need to visit. She'd been in town once before with him, knew the layout, knew the names of the people she'd need to talk to. She went on her own horse, a steady roan named Fletcher that James had offered her use of without making anything of it. The ride in was 4 miles on a clear day with the Laramie Range to the west catching the morning light. Clara let Fletcher set his own pace and watched the land, and thought about what she was going to say if people brought up the situation and how she was going to hold herself while they did. She had been navigating other people's assumptions about her since she was 22 years old and married a schoolteacher's salary. She knew how to do this. Helen Marsh's store was the first stop. Flour, lamp oil, a spool of heavy thread, replacement hinges for the woodshed door. Helen had the order nearly assembled by the time Clara finished reading the list. "How are you settling in?" Helen asked. "Well, thank you," Clara said. "He's a decent man, James Aldrin. Not always the easiest to read, but decent." "I found that," Clara said. Helen set the hinges on the counter. "People in town have figured out the situation isn't what they first thought. Takes time, but they get there." She looked at Clara directly. "The ones who matter have figured it out already." It was gracious. Clara accepted it as it was meant. The second stop was harder. Margaret Horn was at the dry goods counter when Clara came in for the thread and a few items not on the Marsh list. Margaret was the wife of the largest landowner in the valley, a well-dressed woman in her 50s who was perfectly pleasant in the particular way of women who have never had to question whether their pleasantness was being received as they intended. "Mrs. Aldrin," she said, "I heard you'd settled in. How is the ranch keeping?" "I'm Clara Reed," Clara said. "The ranch is keeping well, thank you." Margaret's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The small recalibration of someone who has been corrected and is deciding whether to accept the correction or move past it. She moved past it. "Mr. Aldrin is so fortunate to have help out there," she said. "It's a large property for one person. I always thought he ought to—" A pause, a small smile. "Well, it's good that there's someone looking after the household now." Clara looked at her for one moment. Then she smiled back and said, "The liniment, please, if you have it," and completed the transaction and left. Outside, she stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment and breathed the October air. Margaret Horn was not a bad woman. She was a woman who had grown up in a world where women were looked after and men did the looking, and that world had worked well enough for her that she had never needed to examine it. She spoke about Clara as though Clara were a feature of James Aldrin's life, rather than a person who had made choices to be standing on this sidewalk in this town at this moment. That was the thing Clara wrote about. Had been writing about for 6 years, under a name that wasn't hers, in a paper most people in Coldwater Creek had never seen. She walked to the post office. No new mail. She wasn't expecting any. But she had a letter to send, a reply to the Ohio editor, written 3 nights ago and sealed before she could change her mind. She slid it across the counter and watched the postmaster stamp it. On her way back through town, she passed the church, and Reverend Pike was sitting in the chair he apparently kept outside the building in all weather that permitted it, reading something in a worn black cover that was not a Bible. He looked up when she passed. "Miss Reed," he said. She stopped. Not many people in town called her that. "Reverend? Have you asked him straight out what you want to know?" She looked at him. He was already looking back at his book. She kept walking. But she thought about it the whole ride back to the ranch. Thought about what it would mean to ask a direct question. About the things she wanted to understand. The 4 empty bedrooms, the water line running to nothing, the cellars stocked for a family that wasn't there, the 3rd ranch in the valley that he'd apparently been to for years before she arrived. She thought about what it meant that he'd brought her that book. Thought about what it meant that he'd asked what she needed rather than explaining what he'd already done. She was 3 miles from town when it occurred to her to do the calendar arithmetic she'd somehow avoided doing until now. James had told her the supply order, the veterinary supplies, the ones he'd been at the station to receive, had been placed 4 weeks before her arrival. She knew which rail line the supplies came in on because she'd helped unpack the crate and read the freight bill. The same line she'd traveled on from Columbus. If the order had come a week earlier or a week later, James Aldrin would not have been standing on that platform. He would have received the shipment at the ranch. Thomas Flagg would have left his dead brother's intended mail-order bride alone on a train platform in a Wyoming border town, and whatever happened next would have been a different story entirely. James had been there because his horse was hurt. She sat with that for the rest of the ride home. Not fate, not design, just the way life connects things that aren't connected. A hurt horse and a broken contract and a train schedule and 2 people who happen to occupy the same 30 feet of wooden platform at the same moment in time. She put Fletcher in his stall, gave him water, checked on Dusk, healing well, weight-bearing improving, and went in to start supper. James was already in the kitchen washing up at the sink. He looked at her when she came in. "Any trouble in town?" "No," she said. "No trouble." She hung up her coat. "I sent a letter." He nodded, started drying his hands. "To Ohio," she said. Not sure why she was adding that. Not sure why it felt like it needed to be said. "All right," he said. He moved to set the table. She started on the meal. The kitchen was warm with the fire she'd banked before leaving that morning, and outside the October wind was beginning to say what it meant. The rain came on a Wednesday, not a storm. Wyoming storms announced themselves differently, with a particular quality of sky in the afternoon that Clara had already learned to read. This was just rain, steady and gray, settling in from the northwest in the way high plains rain settles when it means to stay a while. By 4 in the afternoon, the road to town was soft mud. By 6, it was genuinely unpleasant. By 7, when Clara was finishing the supper dishes and James came in from the barn, the temperature had dropped enough that going out again wasn't something either of them was inclined toward. "Dusk is restless," James said. He poured himself coffee and stood at the kitchen window. "Her leg's been like that before when the weather changes. I don't think it's anything wrong, but I'd rather have somebody checking through the night." Clara dried her hands on the dish towel. "I can take the first watch. I'll take first. You take the hours around midnight." He looked at her. "There's the extra blanket in the hall cabinet. It gets cold in the barn. That was how it was decided. Two people who understood a practical situation and addressed it without making it into anything else. Clara brought the extra blanket and a lantern and her small notebook to the barn at midnight. James had a cot set up in the corner near Dusk's stall. He'd apparently done this before during difficult nights. He showed her what to watch for: the way the horse was distributing her weight, the temperature of the tendon site, whether Dusk would accept food or was too distressed to eat. "I'll be in the house," he said. "Knock on the kitchen door if anything changes." He went in. Clara sat on the cot with the blanket around her shoulders and her notebook open, and Dusk breathing softly a few feet away. She wrote in the notebook for a while. Not an article, just observations. The quality of the rain on the barn roof, the particular sound Dusk made when she shifted her weight, the way the lantern light moved on the walls when the draft changed. She had always worked at night when she could. Something about the dark made thinking cleaner, fewer surfaces for attention to scatter against. At 1:30, the rain intensified briefly, drumming hard on the roof, and Dusk moved sharply in her stall. Clara was on her feet before she decided to stand. She checked the leg. Heat level normal, no swelling change, just the horse reacting to the sound. She spoke to Dusk quietly, the low, continuous sound that had started as a deliberate technique in the first week and had since become just the way she talked to the animal. Dusk settled. Clara sat back on the cot. The rain eased again. She became aware that she was not especially tired, which surprised her. She was usually asleep by 10. There was something about this barn at this hour, the particular combination of rain and lantern light, and the uncomplicated company of a horse trying to heal. That was not unpleasant. She was still awake when the barn door opened at 2:15 and James came in with his own lantern and the evident intention of checking on things himself. He stopped when he saw she was awake. "Sorry, thought you might be asleep." "Not yet," she gestured at the cot. "There's room." He sat in the old wooden chair against the wall instead, which she understood was not rejection, just the instinct of a man who maintained appropriate distances without making a production of it. He checked Dusk, ran his hands along the leg the same way she'd taught him, nodded at what he found. "She's all right," he said. "She's all right," Clara agreed. They sat with the rain. A long time went by without either of them speaking. It was not uncomfortable. It had a quality she recognized from late-night medical vigils in Ohio, the peculiar companionship of two people sharing a responsibility in the dark, when ordinary social distances stopped mattering as much. At some point, she was not sure exactly when, James said, not looking at her, "I had a neighbor years back, man named Howard. I could see things weren't going right in his household, the way he was moving through town, the way his wife looked when I saw her at the store. Knew something was wrong." Clara waited. Told myself it wasn't my business, that stepping in was overstepping, waited to be asked. He paused. "They lost everything that winter. Not violently. He just ran out of the will to keep going, I suppose, and made decisions that lost the farm. Moved his family to Cheyenne. I never saw them again." "Did things get better for them in Cheyenne?" "I heard they did eventually." "Then maybe," he said. "But I've never been sure I asked myself the right question. I asked whether it was my place to say something. Maybe the real question was whether he needed someone to say something, regardless of whose place it technically was." Clara sat with that. "Those aren't the same question," she said. "No," he said, "they aren't." The rain had eased to a steady patter. Dusk was quiet. The barn held the warmth of the animal and the two lanterns and whatever it was that happened to the air when two people stopped performing their ordinary social roles and just sat in the same space. Being honest. "I've made that mistake myself," Clara said after a while. He looked at her. "There was a man from Ohio. Cormac. He'd worked out here before I came. He used to write home sometimes. To mutual acquaintances. I heard he was struggling one winter. I told myself it wasn't my place to write to someone I barely knew." She kept her eyes on the wall across from her. "I found out later it had been a very difficult winter for him. He might have been glad to hear from someone." "Is he all right now?" I believe so, but I think about it. A long pause. We make the same mistake from opposite directions, James said quietly. I don't ask because I think I shouldn't. You don't ask because you think you haven't earned the right. Clara looked at him. It was a startlingly perceptive thing to say. She hadn't seen it laid out that plainly before, even in her own writing about the systems that produced exactly that kind of restraint in women. That's probably accurate, she said. James nodded, said nothing more. Dusk shifted once, settled, breathed slowly. The rain came down and the lanterns burned, and neither of them spoke again for a long time. When Clara's head finally dropped toward her chest, she didn't notice it happening. She just went from sitting to sleeping in the ordinary way of exhausted people in warm places. She woke to full gray morning light with a second blanket across her shoulders that had not been there when she fell asleep. James was doing the morning feeding. Dusk was calm and weight-bearing normally. The rain had stopped some time before dawn. Neither of them mentioned the extra blanket. They did the morning work and went in for breakfast, and the kitchen was warm and the coffee was ready because James had started it before she came in. And that Tuesday morning had the texture of something that had quietly shifted into a different shape than it was before. Magistrate Harold Cole arrived on a Friday afternoon with Deputy Warren at his shoulder, and the particular expression of a man who believes he is doing the right thing and is uncomfortable about it anyway. Clara saw them coming from the kitchen window. She had enough time to take off her apron and put the kettle on before James came in from the yard to meet them at the door. She stayed in the kitchen. She could hear clearly. Cole explained it without preamble. A formal complaint had been submitted. He didn't name who, but Clara could guess. Regarding an unregistered woman residing on the Aldrin property in an undefined legal status. Under Wyoming territorial law, a woman without documented standing, not a wife of record, not a contracted employee, not a registered tenant, had no protected claim to residence. He was there to clarify the situation. He laid out the options for James. Clara put the kettle down and walked into the front room. "Magistrate Cole," she said. Both men looked at her. She kept her voice even. "My name is Clara Reed. I'm a former school teacher from Columbus, Ohio. I came to Coldwater Creek in response to a marriage correspondence that was terminated by the death of Arthur Flagg before I arrived. I accepted a verbal employment agreement with Mr. Aldrin in good faith. I have no objection to formalizing that in writing." She looked at Cole directly. "What I'd like to understand is who has standing to require me to document an arrangement I've already made, and on what basis a complaint about my presence here was considered actionable." Cole blinked. He was not accustomed to women asking direct questions about their own legal standing, not because women didn't have such questions, but because most women in 1886 Wyoming had learned that asking them rarely produced useful results. Deputy Warren shifted his weight from one foot to the other. James, standing to her left, said nothing, but she felt him listening the way he listened when something was registering. "The complaint was made by a concerned community member," Cole said carefully. "The question of documentation is procedural." "Then let's complete the procedure," Clara said. "I'll have the contract written up this afternoon. We can sign it before witnesses tomorrow." Cole looked at James, who nodded once. "That will satisfy the requirement," Cole said. He and Warren left. Clara went back to the kitchen and took the kettle off the heat because no one had wanted tea after all. James came in a few minutes later. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, the way he stood when he was processing something. "Thank you," he said, "for speaking to him yourself." "It was my situation," she said. "I should speak to it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I sent a letter to Ohio 2 weeks ago. To the newspaper." Clara turned around. "I saw the postmark on the envelope that fell out of your bag," he said. "I didn't read it, but I wrote to them. To the editor. Asked if the paper would want reporting from Wyoming. Someone who knew the territory from the inside. I used the name you'd been writing under. C.M. Reed." She looked at him. "I should have asked you first," he said. "I know that. I'm telling you now." The kitchen was very quiet. "What did you say in the letter?" she asked. He told her, word for word. He had written carefully, she could tell. He was the kind of man who wrote carefully because he understood that written words had weight. The letter hadn't revealed her identity or promised anything she hadn't agreed to. It had simply asked, in his plain, direct way, whether the paper wanted to continue receiving work from a writer who now had access to Wyoming territory. Clara sat down at the kitchen table. "Did you do that because you thought I wanted it?" she said slowly. "Or because you thought I should want it?" James's expression shifted. A small shift, but visible. The shift of someone who has been asked a question they hadn't considered and cannot answer quickly because honest thought is needed. "I don't know," he said. "I thought I was helping." "You might have been, but you made a decision about my work without asking me. That's the part that matters." She held his gaze. "Do you see the difference?" "Yes," he said. And then, "I'm sorry." Not a defense, not a qualification. Just 2 words, said the way he said most things, plainly because they were true. She looked at him for a moment. "The editor will have received it by now," she said. "What's done is done. If he writes back, I'll decide what to do then." "That's fair." "Mr. Aldrin," she kept her voice level. "The fact that you understood why I asked that question, the fact that you didn't explain it away, that matters to me. I want you to know that." He nodded, set his hat back on. "I'll draw up the contract this evening. We can ask Helen Marsh to witness it tomorrow." And that was how they left it. The contract was signed the following morning with Helen looking on with an expression of careful neutrality. And Clara Reed's name was entered in the records of Coldwater Creek, Wyoming territory, as a documented employee of Aldrin Ranch. It was not what anyone had thought she was, but it was real, and it was hers, and no one could take it away without her consent. That night she sat at her desk and wrote. Not a letter, an article. She wrote about the morning, about what it looked like to stand in a room and speak for yourself when the legal system didn't think you should have to, about the difference between a man who explains your situation for you and a man who steps back and lets you explain it yourself, about how small that difference looks from the outside and how large it feels from the inside. She wrote 3 pages without stopping. She didn't put C.M. Reed at the top. She put Clara Reed. Then she looked at that for a long time, folded the pages, and went to sleep. It came apart quietly, the way most things come apart. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small adjustments that individually meant nothing, and together meant everything. But first, the nights that opened it up. It was the week after the contract signing. Supper had been quiet in the particular way supper was sometimes quiet at Aldrin Ranch. Not tense, just 2 people occupied with their own thinking. Clara had cleared the table, and James had stayed at it with his coffee and his account books. And somewhere around 8 o'clock she had sat back down because she had something to say and had decided to say it. "I should tell you why I really came west," she said. He set down his pen. "I told you about Robert, my husband, and the typhoid and the school closing. All of that is true. But the fuller truth is that I'd been trying to decide what to do with myself for 2 years before I answered Arthur Flagg's advertisement. I'd been writing those articles under the pen name and they'd been getting more attention, and I kept thinking that someone was going to find out who I really was, and that would be the end of the teaching work." She paused. "And then the school closed anyway, and the decision was made for me." "What were the articles saying?" "That women should be able to own property in their own names. That a woman who wants to study law should be admitted to study law. That the mail-order bride system—" She stopped. "Go on." "That the system is built on the assumption that a woman's options are limited enough that she'll agree to marry a man she's never met rather than face what's available to her otherwise. And that this is not a natural arrangement. It's a produced one. Produced by a set of rules that benefit the people who wrote them." James was quiet for a long moment. "You came west on the system you'd been writing against," he said. "I know. Did that feel like hypocrisy?" "Yes." She looked at the table. "But I was also out of options." And I think I wrote more honestly about the system because I knew from the inside what it felt like to have options running out. She looked up. Arthur Flagg's letters were kind. He sounded like a decent man. I thought I could build a reasonable life here. I wasn't wrong to think that. I just arrived to find the man was gone. He was decent, James said. I knew him a little. He was exactly who he wrote himself as. Clara absorbed this. Of all the things he could have offered, he had offered the thing that actually mattered. The confirmation that her judgment had been sound, that she had read the letters correctly, that she had not been deceived. Thank you, she said quietly. That matters more than you might think. The second night was harder. It was 2 days later, and she asked him the question she'd been carrying since Reverend Pike had said what he said outside the post office. Do you know why you've been living here alone? He didn't answer right away. He was at the barn door checking the latch before dark. A small nightly task she'd learned was part of how he ended his day. He kept his hands on the latch. My wife died in 1880, he said, having our first child. The baby lived 3 days. I know, I'm sorry. After that, he stopped, started again. I kept building things, the house, the water system, the extra rooms. I told myself it was for the future, for when I was ready. He paused. I don't think I was building for the future. I think I was building to have something to do with the feeling that I had failed to keep the thing that mattered most. Clara stood very still. You didn't fail, she said. She died. That's not the same thing. I know that in the part of my mind that thinks clearly, he said, but I've spent 6 years living as if it was. So you built a house for a family, and then made sure no family could occupy it, because if you tried again and lost again, then I would know for certain that the problem was me, he said. Mr. Aldrin. She waited until he turned to look at her. The problem has never been you. The problem is that grief tells us stories about ourselves, and we live inside those stories long past when they're useful. He looked at her for a long moment. You learned that from a book? He said. Not unkindly. I learned it from watching Robert die and spending 3 years afterwards convinced that if I had been different in some way, it wouldn't have happened. She held his gaze. We are apparently very similar people in the ways that cause the most trouble. That was the night things shifted. Both of them felt it. And because both of them felt it, 2 people who had each spent years building walls around the parts of themselves that had been hurt, both of them took a step back. Not a dramatic retreat, no argument, no misunderstanding, no betrayal, just the quiet widening of distance that happens when 2 careful people decide, independently and with genuine concern for the other, to give the other person room. James started taking his coffee in the barn in the mornings, said there were things to check before the cold set in. Clara began finishing her evening work earlier, said she had reading to catch up on. They still worked together through the day, still shared meals, still spoke practically and efficiently about everything the ranch required. But the barn door stayed closed after supper. The kitchen table was occupied by 1 person instead of 2. Both of them believed they were protecting the other from something. Both of them were wrong. The week passed this way. Then a second week began the same way, and somewhere in the middle of it, Clara sat in her east room with her notebook open and understood what she was doing. She was making herself small again. She was retreating to the dimensions she'd occupied for most of her adult life. Useful, competent, present when needed, absent when not needed. It was a comfortable shape. She knew it well. She also knew it was not what she wanted. The question was whether she had the nerve to say so. Dusk was fully healed on a Monday. Clara had been watching the recovery for 3 weeks, and she knew before she began the morning examination what she was going to find. The tendon had repaired cleanly. She had done the work right from the beginning, and the horse had cooperated with the patience of an animal that seemed to understand what was required. When she ran her hands down the leg at 7 that morning, the tendon was sound, even normal temperature, no reaction to pressure. Dusk stood with her weight distributed equally across all 4 feet. The horse was healed. The terms of the work contract were met. Clara sat on the wooden stool in the corner of the barn, The stool James had put there in the second week at exactly the right height for the work she was doing without saying anything about it, and let the implications settle over her. She could leave. Not today, not this minute. But she could begin to make arrangements. She had saved her wages carefully. She could get to Laramie. From Laramie, she could get anywhere. She could also not leave. And the question she had been avoiding for 2 weeks was the one she now had to answer. If she stayed, was it because she had chosen to stay or because she had not yet found a sufficient reason to go? From the outside, those two things looked the same. Inside, they were completely different lives. And Clara had spent enough years writing about the difference between choices made freely and choices made by default to be unable to pretend she didn't know how to tell them apart. She went over the evidence, quietly, the way she had always thought, methodically, without sentiment. She had not planned to come to Wyoming. She had come because other options had closed. She had stayed at Aldrin Ranch because the contract required it and because the work was real and worth doing. She had been building, gradually and without planning it, a life that fit around the edges of this place. The barn routines, the fence walking, the supply trips to town, the particular knowledge of how this house ran and what it needed. And she had been talking with James Aldrin in the evenings and learning what kind of man he was, and she had not been indifferent to what she found. That last part was the thing she had to be honest about. She was not indifferent to James Aldrin. She had not been indifferent for several weeks, and the question of whether she was staying because she had chosen this man and this place or because she was afraid to choose anything, that was the question she had to answer before she could say anything to anyone, including herself. She sat in the barn for a long time. Dusk walked to the stall door and put her nose against Clara's shoulder. Clara put her hand up and rubbed the horse's forehead absently. "I know," she said aloud. She did know. She had known for a while. She had just been waiting for the knowing to feel like certainty, and certainty in matters like this was something you built, not something that arrived. She stood up, took off the last of the support wrapping, not needed anymore, and rolled it neatly into her kit. She checked the leg one final time. Everything as it should be. She went in to start breakfast. James was already at the kitchen table with the ranch accounts. He looked up when she came in. "How is she?" "She's fully healed," Clara said. She set her kit on the counter. "The contract terms are met." He looked at her for a moment, then back at the accounts. "I'll need to write up the final payment." "That's fine." She started the fire in the stove. "Mr. Aldrin." "Yes." She kept her back to him, kept her voice even. "I'd like to stay. Not because the contract requires it, and not because I don't have other options. Because I'm choosing to." She turned around. "I think you should know the difference before I say anything further." James had put down his pen. He was looking at her the way he looked when something was asking for real thought. "I'd like to hear what you'd say further," he said. "Not yet," she said. "You go first." It surprised him. She could see that. "There's a letter," he said slowly, "on the desk in my study. I wrote it last week, and I haven't sent it. I was going to tell you about it, and then I decided not to because I thought you needed space, and then I realized I was making that decision for you again." "What kind of letter?" "To the editor in Ohio, the real letter, not the earlier one, telling him the full name of the person who's been writing as C.M. Reed, and that she has a piece ready to submit." He paused. "Under her own name." Clara went very still. "You wrote that without asking me." "I wrote it without sending it," he said. "I wrote it because it's what I thought you deserved, and then I stopped because I realized I was doing the same thing again. Deciding what was right for you without asking what you wanted." She looked at him for a long moment. "Can I read it?" she said. He got up and came back with a folded piece of paper. She read it standing at the kitchen counter. It was brief, precise, and said exactly what it said, that a writer of genuine quality and original thought was ready to submit work under her own name. It did not romanticize. It did not explain her circumstances. It simply made the case in the plainest language that this was a writer worth publishing. She folded it back up. "It's a good letter," she said. "Do you want me to send it?" "I want to send it myself," she said, "with my own signature under yours, if you're willing." He held out his hand. She passed the letter back. He held it between them for a moment. "I've been alone here for 6 years," he said quietly. "Not because I preferred it, because I was afraid to do it badly again." "I know," she said. "I don't want to do it badly," he said. "With you." "Then don't make my decisions for me," she said. "And I won't make yours. That's the whole contract." He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a change in his expression, but she had learned to read his face, and she knew it for what it was. "That seems fair," he said. "It's not just about fair," she said. "That's what I keep trying to tell you." He looked at her. "It's about seeing me," she said, "as a person who knows her own mind, not as a situation that needs managing." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the open land. "I see you," James said. "I've seen you since the station." "I know," she said. "I'm asking you to keep seeing me even when it's inconvenient, even when what I want is different from what you'd have decided on my behalf." "I can do that," he said. "I won't always get it right." "Neither will I," she said. They looked at each other across the kitchen of a ranch that had been built for more people than had ever lived in it, and the 4 empty bedrooms, and the water line running to the empty western field, and the cellar stocked for a family that didn't exist yet, were all present in the room with them without needing to be named. "Breakfast," Clara said finally. "Yes," said James. And they made breakfast together in the cold October morning, and the kitchen was warm, and Dusk moved freely in the barnyard for the first time since she was hurt. And the letter to Ohio sat on the kitchen table waiting to be signed by 2 people and sent. They were married on the first Wednesday in November. Not because it was romantic, because it was the practical solution to the legal situation, and because both of them had arrived by their own separate routes at the decision that it was also what they wanted, and because James Aldrin was a man who combined practical and personal in everything he did and could not see the point of separating them now. Reverend Pike conducted the brief ceremony with Helen Marsh and Ted Norris as witnesses. The 4 of them stood in the front parlor of the ranch house, and the Reverend read the necessary words, and James and Clara said the necessary responses, and the whole business was done in 20 minutes. Helen cried a little. Ted looked uncomfortable with Helen crying, and stared fixedly at the ceiling. James stood straight and said his words with the same direct plainness he applied to everything. Clara looked at him while she said hers and meant what she said. When it was done, Helen produced a cake she had apparently baked in anticipation, and they sat at the large dining room table, 4 people at a table built for 10, and ate cake and drank coffee, and the conversation was easy in the way of people who know each other well enough to be quiet together. After Helen and Ted had gone, James and Clara stood on the porch in the November cold and looked out at the land. "It's a good property," Clara said. "It is," he said. "The North Pasture expansion. You said you'd been putting it off." "I have been." "I'd like to help plan it," she said, "if you're willing." "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. She looked at him. "You could have asked." "I'm asking now," he said. "Better late." She laughed. A real laugh, not a polite one. He looked a little surprised by it, which made her laugh again. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." They went inside. The letter to Ohio had been signed and sent the week before. Both their signatures, as she had asked, because it was her work and his belief in her work, and she saw no reason to separate those things. The editor had already written back, a brief and enthusiastic reply that said he would run the first piece as soon as it arrived, and was there more where it came from? Came. There was more. There was considerably more. Clara had been writing in the evenings since the night she had stayed awake in the barn with James and understood what she was going to do. And the pieces were sharper than anything she had written under C.M. Reed, because she was writing them as herself now, with the full weight of her own name and her own history behind every word. She was writing about the mail-order bride system, about what it felt like to arrive in a place as a transaction and be treated as a person anyway, about the difference between charity and respect, and why conflating them did harm in both directions. About a man who built 4 extra bedrooms and a water line to nowhere, and a cellar stocked for people who weren't there yet, because he understood without being able to articulate it that the future was something you prepared for, not something you waited to feel ready for. She did not name James in the pieces. She named the ideas. The ideas were enough. The weeks that followed had the texture of something being built. Not constructed to a plan, but built the way real things are built, piece by piece, with adjustments as you go, and a willingness to pull apart what isn't working and try again. They argued twice in November. Once about the placement of the new woodshed, which James had decided on without asking her, and she had pointed out would block the winter light from the kitchen in the afternoon. He had been defensive for about 20 minutes, and then acknowledged she was right and moved the planned location 6 feet west. The second argument was about the schedule for the school she was proposing to set up in the barn's empty second room, which James thought was premature and Clara thought was already overdue, and they had debated this with some heat for an entire evening before arriving at a compromise. They would set up the room through November and begin in December with a reassessment in January. Both arguments ended with the problem solved. Neither of them sulked. Neither of them kept score. These were small things. But small things were what lives were actually made of. In December, she started the school. 6 children from surrounding ranches Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, reading and arithmetic, and, for the 3 oldest, the basics of written composition. She taught in the spare room with a wood stove James had installed the previous week without comment. And she used materials she'd ordered from Cheyenne and paid for from her saved wages. On the first day, James came to the door at the end of the lesson and looked at the children putting on their coats and said nothing. But she saw his face. She understood his face by then. That evening, he said quietly, as they were clearing the supper dishes, "You're a good teacher." "How would you know? You only watched for 2 minutes." "I watched how they were sitting," he said. "Children sit differently in a room where they feel safe to make mistakes." She looked at him. "That's an observant thing to say." "I went to school once," he said. "I remember the difference." She handed him a dish to dry. "You should come to the Thursday session." "I have fence work on Thursdays." "The fence can wait 30 minutes." He came to the Thursday session. He sat in the back and said nothing, and the children ignored him. But she noticed that for the rest of that week he was quieter than usual, in a way that was not sad, just full. Spring arrived the way Wyoming spring always arrived. Late, sudden, and absolute. One morning in late April, the light was different. Not warmer exactly, but more present, more itself. Clara noticed it through the kitchen window while she was making coffee, the particular angle of early sun that said the long season was genuinely over and something new was beginning. She took 2 cups of coffee to the barn where James was already at work. He was checking the north fence line plans, the expansion they had been working on since November, drawings spread on the old workbench, the materials ordered and arriving in stages. He took the coffee without looking up from the plans. "South line is ready to post," he said. "I was thinking we'd start there and work north." "That makes sense." She looked at the drawings. "What about the corner at the creek? The ground's soft there in spring." "We'll wait until June on the corner." "June is fine." She stood beside him, and they looked at the drawings together. The expanded pasture, the new water connection to the western building site where the walls were now framed and waiting for the roof to go on. The property, as it would look when all the things James had been half building for 6 years were finally completed. It was a large ranch. It required 2 people to run it well. This was obvious to both of them. It had been obvious for a while. "Helen told me yesterday that the Caldwell family is looking for a teacher for their youngest," Clara said. "They're 8 miles out. I was thinking of riding over. I can go with you Saturday. I can go alone." He looked at her. "I know you can," he said. "I'd like to come." She considered this. "All right, Saturday." This was how they had learned to operate. The distinction that mattered to her, not whether he offered, but whether he listened to her answer, was one he had worked at understanding. He didn't always get it right, but he got it right more often than not, and when he didn't, she said so, and he adjusted. She had written a piece about this for the Ohio paper. The editor had run it on the front page of the second section. She had received 12 letters in response, 11 from women she didn't know, 1 from a woman in Denver who said she was a lawyer and wanted to correspond. Clara had written back to the Denver lawyer the same evening she received the letter. James had watched her write the response with an expression she had come to recognize as the specific look he got when something confirmed a belief he'd had about her, and he was glad to have it confirmed. "What?" she said without looking up. "Nothing. Mr. Aldrin. You're going to be someone people know about," he said. "Not just in Ohio." She looked up. "People already know about me. C.M. Reed has readers." "Clara Reed Aldrin will have more," he said. "That's all I'm saying." She looked at him for a moment, then she went back to the letter. But she was smiling. The school had grown. What had started as 6 children twice a week was now 8 children 3 times a week, with 2 older students who came on Saturday mornings for more advanced work. Clara had written to the Territorial Education Office in Cheyenne about formalizing the arrangement. They had written back with interest. The process was slow. Everything official was slow, but it was moving. James had expanded the schoolroom. He had done this, she noted, after she mentioned that the room was getting crowded, and he had asked her first what dimensions would be useful and then done the work according to her specifications. Progress. On a Thursday afternoon in early May, she was finishing the school session when she heard the barn door open and turned to find Dusk walking freely in the yard. Not in her stall, not in the paddock, just moving through the open yard in the way of an animal that has been healed long enough to have forgotten she was ever otherwise. The children saw the horse, and several of them ran to the fence to watch. Clara watched too. Dusk moved with the loose, even gait of complete recovery. All 4 legs bearing weight equally, the left front that had been so carefully tended now indistinguishable from the others. The horse walked to the middle of the yard and stopped and looked around at the children at the fence, and at Clara near the schoolroom door, and at James, who had appeared from the direction of the equipment shed. She stood there, Dusk, right in the middle of everything, looking at each of them in turn. One of the children, a girl named May, who'd been coming since December and was the best reader in the group, said, "She's pretty." "She is," Clara said. "Did she hurt her leg?" "She did. She healed." "Did you fix it?" Clara thought about this. "We fixed it together," she said. "Mr. Aldrin and I." May considered this with the seriousness of 8 years old. "My daddy says some things only get fixed when 2 people do it." Clara looked across the yard at James, who was leaning on the fence watching the horse with the look he got when something was right. "Your daddy is a smart man," she said. That evening, after supper, after the dishes and the lamp oil refilled and the barn checked, and all the small completions of an ordinary day, Clara sat at her desk and finished the piece she had been working on for 2 weeks. It was the most personal thing she had written. It was about a train platform and a woman with $7.50 and the particular dignity of knowing that your circumstances do not define your worth. It was about a man who built things in advance of the life he was hoping to live, and what it meant when that life finally showed up. It was about the mail-order system that had brought her west, and the ways that system had failed her, and the strange grace of the failure. Because if Arthur Flagg had been alive on the platform, she would have married a decent man she'd never met, and built a reasonable life in a house she had not chosen, and she would never have stood in a barn at 2 in the morning in the rain listening to someone say the thing that opened up everything she'd been keeping closed. She did not write it sentimentally. She never wrote sentimentally. She wrote it the way she had always written, plainly, with attention to the specific gravity of specific facts, trusting the reader to feel what the facts contained. She signed it Clara Reed Aldrin, Coldwater Creek, Wyoming Territory, May 1887. She folded it for the Morning Post. Then she blew out the lamp and went to the window and looked out at the ranch in the spring dark. The barn with its lamp still burning, the fences running out into the pale grass, the water line that now ran to the western building where the walls were up and the roof would go on in June. The whole shape of a place that had been built for more people than one and was finally actually occupied. She had arrived here on a train with $7.50 and a bag full of books, believing she was coming to be someone's wife, and finding instead that she was coming to be herself. To discover what she was made of when the ordinary structures fell away. To learn what she chose when choosing was actually an option. She had chosen this. The lamp in the barn went out. The ranch settled into the quiet of spring night. Far to the west, the Laramie Range was a dark line against the last of the sky. She stood at the window for a while longer, looking out. Then she went to bed in her own room, the room that had once been the east guest room with the lock on the inside, in the house that was now hers as much as anyone's, on the land she had not come looking for, and had decided to stay on, with the man who had asked the right questions more often than not, and was still learning, as she was, how to ask them better. She was not the woman she had been in Columbus, not the woman who had answered an advertisement because her options had run out. She was something harder to name and more fully herself, a teacher and a writer and a rancher's partner, and a woman who knew the difference between a choice made from fear and a choice made from want, and who had finally, at 34, made the second kind. In the barn, Dusk slept in her clean stall on sound legs that had been healed by two people working the same problem from opposite sides. In the spring morning coming, there would be fence posts to set, and a school session, and a letter to mail, and the ordinary good work of a life that had been chosen. The circle had closed. Not perfectly. Not without cost. Not the way stories closed in novels, where everything resolved into its proper shape, and the loose ends tied themselves. But closed in the way that mattered. The way that said, I was here, and I chose this, and this was mine. Clara Reed Aldrin turned from the window and slept. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.
There is a moment near the beginning of this story that tells you everything you need to know about what kind of story it is. A woman stands alone on a train platform in Wyoming Territory. She has $7.50. The man she traveled 2,000 miles to marry is dead. The brother who was supposed to help her has already walked away. And she is standing there, counting money she already knows the amount of, because her hands need something to do. She is not waiting to be rescued, she is assessing her options. That distinction is the entire heart of this story. Clara Reed arrives in Coldwater Creek as a transaction. That is how the system saw her. That is how the town saw her. A man paid money, a woman got on a wagon, and the community drew the only conclusion it knew how to draw. But Clara Reed was never a transaction. She was a school teacher, a writer, a widow, a woman with a mind sharp enough to correct a horse's bandaging in the first hour, and a voice clear enough to face a magistrate without flinching. She was a full human being who had been placed, by circumstance, inside a story that reduced her to a single line. And the quiet, persistent work of this story is watching her refuse to stay inside that single line. What James Aldrin learns slowly, imperfectly, across months of shared work and honest conversation, is the difference between treating someone fairly and actually seeing them. He is not a villain. He is something more common and more instructive than a villain. He is a decent man who assumes that doing the right thing is enough. Paying fair wages, keeping his word, explaining the situation to people in town. These are all good things. But they are not the same as asking Clara what she wants. They are not the same as stepping back when she needs to speak for herself. They are not the same as recognizing that a person who knows her own mind does not need to be managed, even kindly, even with good intentions. The lesson James learns is one most of us need to learn at least once. There is a difference between helping someone and deciding for them, between protecting someone and confining them, between offering what you think a person should want and asking what they actually want. These distinctions are small from the outside. They are enormous from the inside. And Clara teaches him this not through argument or bitterness, but through the patient, dignified work of continuing to be herself in his presence. She corrects him when he is wrong. She credits him when he is right. She does not make herself smaller to make him more comfortable, and she does not punish him for the ways he is still learning. That is the deepest lesson in this story. Not that love conquers all, not that the right person will fix what is broken in you, but that two people who are honest about their own wounds and patient with each other's blind spots and willing to be corrected without becoming defensive, those two people can build something real. Clara came west looking for a life that was possible. She found something better than that. She found a life she chose. And that difference between a life that is merely possible and a life that is genuinely chosen is what this story is, at its core, about.